Professor George Weigel is a Catholic theologian and one of America's leading public intellectuals. He holds the William E. Simon Chair in Catholic Studies at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. Professor Weigel is perhaps best known for his widely translated and internationally acclaimed two-volume biography of Pope St. John Paul II, Witness to Hope. He is the recipient of 19 honorary doctorates in fields including divinity, philosophy, law, and social science, and has been awarded the Papal Cross Pro Ecclesia et Pontifice. George, I want to begin by welcoming you to EWTN Great Britain. It is a joy to be with you, live from our studio in Walsingham, and in the words of St. John Paul II to us in England when he visited, welcome to the Dowry of Mary, where the faithful for centuries have made pilgrimage to her shrine, and the statue of Our Lady of Walsingham, present here, lifts our minds to meditate on our Mother. So I want to begin, if I could, by asking you about your friendship with St. John Paul II. At a dinner in 1996, you explained to Pope John Paul that he could not see a word of what you would write about him until you handed him the published book. To which he replied, "That's obvious. Now let's start talking about something interesting." So, in the light of this delightful anecdote, I would love it if you could open up for our audience a bit about your decades-long friendship with a modern saint.
Well, first of all, let me greet all of you from Maryland, which was founded in 1634 by English Catholics seeking religious freedom in the New World. So we are at the heart of Catholicism in the former colonies. And it's always good to talk to friends in Mother England. I wrote about John Paul II in various fora, really from the beginning of the pontificate. I think the first piece I ever published about him was in 1979 when the encyclical Redemptor Hominis came out. I was fascinated by this figure. In 1992, I published the first book in English and possibly in any language, making the argument that the Pope and the Church had been crucial in the collapse of European communism. And while I had met John Paul II briefly before that book came out, its publication was the occasion for our first serious conversation. And I think he appreciated the book, not because I had made him the hero, but because I had made the argument that he believed was accurate and that he himself had made in his encyclical Centesimus Annus, namely that a revolution of conscience, a moral revolution, had preceded and made possible the political revolution of 1989 in Central and Eastern Europe. Our personal conversation intensified. After that, I was able to be of some help to him and others in preparing for his visit to the United States and the United Nations in 1995. And then in the middle of that year, I was reading a truly dreadful biography of John Paul II by a fellow named Tad Schultz. And it occurred to me, I can do better than this. I mean, the idea just came into my head, I can do better than this. So I discussed that with Joaquin Navarro Valls, John Paul's press spokesman for many years, Spanish layman. And then in December 1995, the Pope made it abundantly clear that he thought it would be a good idea if I did this, and that he would cooperate. That then led to the conversation in March 1996 when we talked about the ground rules, how are we going to make this work? And I said, for the book to be credible, you can't see a word of it till I hand you the finished product. And he said what you quoted. So he was completely cooperative throughout the 2.5 years of preparation of the book. He actually pushed me into areas that I probably would not have explored were I just thinking this through on my own. For example, my favorite chapter in the book is in Witness to Hope, is about his life as a young priest. I think it's the third chapter in the book. I would not have spent more than a few pages on that if he had not said to me, in order to understand me, you have to understand the young people I worked with when I was newly ordained priest. So it was that kind of thing that helped me to get into his life in order to explain it from the inside out rather than the outside only.
Mm. Yeah, it makes me think about his letter to artists, which was very formative for me as a young person. Just an absolutely beautiful letter that went into the vocation of artists. But I'm very aware as well that he really formed himself by serving young people when he'd just become a priest and a chaplain to them, and obviously teaching them at the university as well. So, yeah, thank you for that. That's a really beautiful story about your collaboration and friendship. Now, St. John Paul II, for many, promoted an authentic civilization of truth and love, where faith and reason were described as two wings upon which we can be led to contemplation and adoration of God. Please, can you open up for us what this vision of his was and what we can learn from it today?
John Paul II knew the history of the 20th century in his bones. He was a young university student during the horrors of the Nazi occupation of Poland from 1939 to 1945. He then spent the next several decades battling communism. He lost friends in the Holocaust of European Jewry. He lost classmates in the underground seminary during the Nazi occupation. I mean, he knew that the 20th century had been a horror show in many respects. The question was, why had that happened? And you get an insight into that from his letter as a young auxiliary bishop to the committee preparing the agenda for the Second Vatican Council, in which he wrote that all of this terrible stuff, 2 world wars, 3 totalitarian systems, oceans of blood, mountains of corpses, the greatest persecution of the church in history, Holocaust, Ukrainian Holodomor, I mean, just go through the list, was the result of defective, deeply defective, dangerously defective, and lethal ideas of who we are as human beings. And the church needed to lift up an alternative view of the human, which we find in the person of Jesus Christ. For as the Second Vatican Council teaches us in Gaudium et Spes 22, Christ reveals both the face of the merciful Father and the truth about our humanity. Now, where does truth and love fit into that? Christ is the incarnate Word, through whom all things were made and who holds all things in being. And therefore, all truths from whatever source incline towards the capital T truth, who is thrice holy God, like iron shavings to a magnet. As for truth and love, the redemption of the world comes through not an act of self-assertion. Jesus does not say to Pilate, look what I can do to you, buddy. Mm-hmm. He accepts the suffering of the cross in obedience to the will of the Father, and history is returned to its true course. So redemptive suffering, redemptive love is the royal path to human flourishing.
It's interesting as you say that, because I know there's quite a popular film that's been made of his life, and it contains the line that evil eats itself like a snake, and that was very much the case with, starting with the communists and the Nazis and then the communists just replacing each other as the systems that really destroyed civilization.
Which film?
Which film? I think it's called Carol.
Oh, it's a dreadful film. It's a complete fiction from one end to the other. It's brilliantly acted. The actor is wonderful.
He looks like John Paul
It's
II.
a complete fiction. And I wrote a long
I'm
article
I'm
about that years ago, which you can go look up.
I'm absolutely overjoyed that you've shared that. It's probably like what we might call a mythology, or some kind of mythological hagiography, but
Well,
nothing biographical about it.
when I
Yeah.
saw it, I thought, this life is dramatic enough. Why do you have to, make this stuff up? It's a total mess. But it's it's as I said, Pyotr Adamczyk is a wonderful actor, and he did a great
Yeah,
job.
he is. Yeah.
But no, the film is just fiction from A to Z.
I'm overjoyed you've shared that with our audience.
So,
That's really funny because I wasn't aware. I'm kind of curious that is your conclusion. I think that's really interesting.
we're
Now,
marrying truth and love here, David.
yeah, it might have abandoned the pathway of truth in some respects. Now, you did actually just touch upon this with St. John Paul's life being marked with significant suffering. In your writing as a theologian, you have reflected on the movement from absurdity to mission with regards to suffering. Please, could you open up this important spiritual insight for our audience and how it specifically relates to Pope John Paul II?
John Paul II Karol Wojtyła was a world-class intellectual. He was a man who had thought deeply and over an extended period of time about the difficulties of making sense of the world in which we live, which came home to him, I think, in a particularly powerful way when he began teaching at the Catholic University of Lublin in Poland in the mid-1950s. Lublin was the only Catholic university between Berlin and Vladivostok, 14 time zones. One of his colleagues in the philosophy department said to me, Lublin was the only place between Berlin and Vladivostok where philosophy was free. It was not distorted by ideology. And what Wojtyła discovered in his introductory philosophical ethics courses was that his students wanted to make sense of the suffering that they and their families had experienced during the Second World War and were now experiencing by being faithful Catholics in Stalinist era Poland. Now, he also understood that the world had changed philosophically, and that a kind of top-down deductive philosophical approach to finding meaning in the human condition was just not going to work anymore. You couldn't go from, as philosophy had done for millennia, you couldn't go from cosmology to anthropology any longer. You had to go the other way around. You had to start with philosophical anthropology, or what we called, when I was studying philosophy before the English language was deconstructed, philosophy of man. Now we would have to say philosophy of the human person, I suppose.
I think in this country we say metaphysical anthropology or even phenomenology, so that kind of ascending theology.
Yeah, no, from the bottom up, and he did it. He did that analysis through, because his principal interest was philosophical ethics. What is the structure of human moral decision making? Is there a given within us that leads us to make the right decision for the right reason, and to do so as a matter of habit, which is, in medieval Latin, habitus, another word for virtue. So that was his philosophical project, and it, in some sense, ran parallel to his deep interest in St. John of the Cross. As you know, his first doctoral dissertation was called Faith in the Thought of St. John of the Cross, written at the Angelicum in Rome in the late 1940s. And of course, John of the Cross is one of the great theologians of suffering, dark nights, et cetera, and passing through the dark night to the light of truth. So that all, I think, meshed in his mind in a powerful way that then led him to be able to write, speak, preach in a way that made sense to people in the late 20th century. His was not so much a syllogistic philosophy, A, B, therefore C. It's a more, as you put it, phenomenological philosophy.
And when we look at the crucifix he chose for his crook, it was very much focusing on the agony of Jesus. And I'm sure you'd agree as a biographer that him losing his father, the assassination attempt, his crippling illness, they all contributed to his capacity to empathize, which I think a lot of people would see just simply looking at photographs of him embracing people who are sick and suffering. He seemed to really reflect Jesus as someone who suffered and therefore could enter into a profound compassion with his neighbor wherever he found them. So I do really appreciate that answer. I think it's very illuminating.
If I could
I'd just like to yeah, go on. Yeah, go on. Yeah. Go on. Yeah.
I think the final expression of that was the last Good Friday of his life. He was unable physically to go to the Colosseum for the Via Crucis. Cardinal Ratzinger led the Via Crucis that Good Friday. But the Pope watched the Via Crucis in the chapel of the papal apartment. And it was televised, or there were pictures of him watching the TV, embracing the cross.
Yes.
Embracing a big crucifix. And the pictures were all from behind him. And I spent most of that Holy Saturday morning on television here in the United States answering the question, why didn't they show his face? He must look terrible. I said, no, you've missed the whole point of the last 26 years. He's never been saying, look at me. He's
exactly,
been saying, look at Christ. And it is Christ on the cross who leads us to the final victory of eternal life.
And it's so beautiful. That's why people are so moved by what he said wherever he went. Of course, he was charismatic and people might have seen him as a bit of a celebrity, but that was never what he was about. So I do think your work does draw out that dimension, which can often be overlooked by people. Now, if I was to carry on here, just to refer to something quite important, I think, St. John Paul II is viewed by many today as the Pope of Vatican II and the greatest enactor of its legacy. Please, could you help us understand the relationship between Pope John Paul II and the Second Vatican Council, its purpose, and to what end?
As you know, I've published about a year ago a book called To Sanctify the World, The Vital Legacy of Vatican II, in which John Paul II obviously plays a significant role. I would say first, he grasped John the 23rd's intention in summoning the council in a very powerful way. Pope John the 23rd did not summon the Second Vatican Council to reinvent Catholicism. He summoned the Second Vatican Council to reinvigorate Catholicism in order to do what? In order to evangelize. A month before the council opened, John the 23rd in a radio address said, the purpose of the council in one word is evangelization. Now, there's a direct line between that and what John Paul II called the new evangelization, which he explicated in the encyclical Redemptoris Missio, the mission of the Redeemer. In order to evangelize, the church had to have persuasive, answers that the late 20th century, early 21st century world could hear to two great questions. Who are we as human beings?
Yeah.
What are our origins? What is our character? What is our destiny? Are we just congealed stardust? Is there something more to the human person and the human condition? And how do we form authentic community? How do we form authentic human community? So many failed attempts to do that in modernity, whether that's the fascist attempt or the Nazi attempt or the consumerist attempt or the communist attempt. Where do we find models of true community? John Paul II believed the council had identified the answers to those two great questions. First, in what we discussed a moment ago, in Christ we find both the truth about God and the truth about us. And secondly, that the church is what the council called in its dogmatic constitution on the church, the sacrament of the unity of the human race. If you want to find authentic human community, you find its template in the church. Now, Pope was also aware that in coming to the papacy, Karol Wojtyła was certainly aware that there had been a lot of chaos and confusion in the years after the council. That was in part due to the fact, as I explain in the book To Sanctify the World, because unlike the previous 20 councils, Vatican II did not provide the keys to its own authentic interpretation. If you want to know what Nicaea I was about in 325, you read the Nicene Creed. If you want to know what Ephesus and Chalcedon were about in the early 5th century, you read their dogmatic definitions. Other councils condemned heresies, wrote canons into the legal system of the church. Council of Trent authorized a catechism. These were all keys to authoritative interpretations of what a council had done. Vatican II did none of that. And my suggestion in the book is that the pontificates of John Paul II and Benedict XVI are one 35-year arc of authoritative interpretation of Vatican II by two men who were key figures at Vatican II and who knew the council from inside. Ratzinger as theologian, Wojtyła as young bishop. So I think that's the new evangelization as the fruit of the Second Vatican Council is the linkage between Vatican II and John Paul II. And that's why I thought at the time, 10 years ago, it was appropriate that John the 23rd and John Paul II were canonized on the same day. As I said on American television, these are the two bookends of the council. The man who summoned it and the man who gave it its authoritative interpretation.
That's so true. In the letter to Artists, he does actually say, know yourself. He quotes the Oracle of Delphi, which is, I always found that very moving, that it was written on their temples. So he started with that. But of course, the council was pretty much the largest meeting of people ever in the history of the world. I mean, the amount of people are called from all parts of the world, and very much to do with modern technology that could actually make this happen. And obviously, as a fruit, he then went out to the most traveled pope in history. He went everywhere and he related to everyone. So I think that was also an incarnation of the council's spirit. And obviously, as you've said, a hermeneutic of continuity through the subsequent two popes, which help us to begin to reflect, I think, correctly on the council. So that's really helpful. You chose to entitle your biography of Pope John Paul II as Witness to Hope. Please could you elucidate for us your choice of this title and how it might carry a prophetic message for the church even today?
Well, Witness to Hope is the first of two volumes of biography. As you noted at the beginning, the second is called The End and the Beginning. Witness to Hope I chose for the title because that's how the Pope defined himself at the United Nations in 1995. At the end of that address, he said, I am a witness to hope. My faith And my hope is centered in my faith. My faith is in Jesus Christ, who reveals the truth about God and man, et cetera, et cetera. So that seemed to me the appropriate title for the first volume of the book. And at the end of a century that really had, as we've discussed throughout this program, the human race had a pretty bad 20th century. I mean, we know all of the achievements, but the misery was quite astonishing. He nonetheless came through that, having experienced it personally, seeing that a better future was possible if we lived by the truths that he believed were, as he put it on Mount Sinai in 2000, inscribed on the human heart before they were inscribed on tablets of stone. So he was not an optimist in some Pollyanna sense of the term. He was a man of hope. But hope is sturdier than optimism because hope is rooted in faith. And that for him, that faith that God's purposes will be vindicated in history, that's what we learn from Easter. That faith was the sturdy rock on which his hope was built. And I thought that phrase, witness to hope, expressed that.
That's really helpful. I didn't know that. In his address in 1982 at Wembley, here in England, John Paul II stated, "Brothers and sisters, we must be a people of prayer and deep spirituality. Our society needs to recover a sense of God's loving presence and a renewed sense of respect for his will. Open up for us, if you can, a deeper sense of his message. All around us in the West, we see the advance of atheistic humanism and secularism, stagnating the culture of Europe, as reflected in its impoverished architecture and a collapse of the foundations of its core values. What then is the spirit we can learn from St. John Paul II to reawaken a truly evangelical Catholicism in our times that can enlighten every aspect of civilization?"
The salvation, if you will, the renewal of Western civilization, not only in Europe, but here in North America, is going to come less through argument than through witness. This was the insight of Paul VI. Modern man listens more attentively to witnesses than to teachers, and if he listens to teachers, it's because they were first witnesses. Well, that was embodied in John Paul II, witness and teacher. Our world is becoming so unbearable in many ways. You look at the mental health statistics all over the Western world, and they're really frightening. That at some point, it seems to me, the sum total of human unhappiness is going to demand that people ask, isn't there a better way to live? Now, if Christians can model that better way of living in their joyful embrace of each other, of service to the world, ultimately rooted in their joyful embrace of Christ crucified and risen, then when people ask happy Christians, joyful Christians, how can you live that way? And I can't.
Yeah.
Then the door is open to the evangelical invitation. I can live that way because I'm a friend of Jesus Christ. May I tell you about him?
Exactly, yeah. And that's very attractive, and certainly the postmodern experience bizarrely does favour subjective testimony as being a source of authority. And of course the Gospels are based on witness fundamentally. And it's obviously worth something in the court of law. That's a very interesting perspective, and I do think from personal experience and looking in the lives of others that does play probably the most profound factor. And it was always like that in Christianity from the beginning. You know, St. Peter, you killed the author of life, but I'm a witness that he has been raised from the dead, you know. So I really agree with you. Is martyr Greek for witness? I think
Yes.
is that right?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. And there's an American scholar, I suppose you would call him a historical sociologist or a sociologically oriented historian, a fellow named Rodney Stark, who's written several books on why Christianity won. Why did
Hmm.
Christians win the day in the first 4 centuries AD? And, with respect to great Christian minds like Ignatius of Antioch, Ignatius of Lyon, Tertullian, et cetera, it wasn't because of argument. It was because of witness.
Yeah.
It was
Correct.
because of modeling a more humane way of life in
Hmm.
a brutal world. I mean,
Hmm.
when I'm talking to audiences here in the U.S., I say, everybody has seen the movie Gladiator 5 times.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah. Yeah.
ubiquitous. You
Yeah.
can't escape. Gladiator is not in the 5th century BC. It's halfway through the 2nd century AD. The film
Hmm.
begins with Marcus Aurelius.
Yeah.
And in that
Okay.
world, even the strongest, noblest, whatever people like Maximus are
Hmm.
totally at the whim of power and wickedness. Christians modeled something different in that world, and that was attractive.
Correct. And obviously they built their altars on the tombs of
Yeah,
martyrs. The bishops who turned up at the first councils in Nicaea were all in suffering in some way. Some had their eyes gouged out or had been subject to torture. It's very easy to overlook this, and I think it's true to say that women and slaves were a big part of the original converts simply because they got a better life. So I have to say, from recent research, the atheist historians of today, do struggle to explain how monotheistic Judaism came to believe in a historical resurrection and were able to convince Jews and pagans. Because even being able to explain that as a historical phenomenon is actually really difficult without giving some credence to the witness that is stated.
well, I think the most powerful case for this has been made by the Anglican biblical scholar N.T. Wright in his book, The Resurrection of the Son of God. There is no Christianity without the resurrection. There is no form of Christianity ever known, early Christianity, without the resurrection. So, why did these timid souls from east of nowhere, over 2.5 centuries, convert what Rod Stark estimates is between a third and a half of the Mediterranean world? That's the phenomenon we're dealing with here. And Tom Holland, another English writer, in his book Dominion, then shows what immense effect that had on the entire course of Western civilization. And people like Richard Dawkins and whatnot, they just seem silly in face of all of that. I mean, the notion that all of what Holland demonstrates in Dominion just happened because a couple of dozen people had a kooky idea 2,000 years ago. Our friend has been raised from the dead. It's just ludicrous on the face of it.
Sure. Saint Paul, if Christ did not rise from the dead, then our faith is in vain. And yeah, of course, I think it's easy to show with the oral traditions that are behind the gospel accounts that this was contemporary information. If you disagreed, you could go and talk to the people involved and they would corroborate. So, in the context of historical documents, it is unprecedented for its proximity to the events contained. We agree with Greek philosophers and their biographies based on accounts that are hundreds of years later. So, I do think there is a certain profound witness historical basis to the Gospels, which is inexorable from its overall power and potency. Pope Benedict XVI, in an address when he spoke to the British government at the House of Westminster Hall, he said to everyone gathered, Britain has emerged as a pluralist democracy which places great value on the freedom of speech, freedom of political affiliation, and respect for the rule of law, the common law. with a strong sense of individual rights and duties and of the equality of all citizens before the law. How would you counsel British Catholics today to safeguard this inheritance?
That was a remarkable speech that Pope Benedict gave in Westminster Hall, the place of the trial of Thomas More, among many other things. And it was even more remarkable because here's the German Pope who thanked the British people for winning the Battle of Britain in 1940. You know, this is something quite striking, and I remember very well all of the enormous fuss before Benedict came to Britain, and of course, as you remember, he started in Scotland, and there was Her Majesty, the Queen, and you had these two utterly admirable octogenarians demonstrating to the world this is how adults behave. And, you know, all of that fuss was just blown away, and he could say what he did. I have spent a fair amount of time in the United Kingdom. My place of residence when I'm in London is the great St. Patrick's Parish in Soho Square, which is really the beating heart of the new evangelization in the West End and perhaps beyond that. And I think the reason why St. Patrick's works, if you will, is that it is a combination of unapologetic Catholicism. It's all-in Catholicism, as I call it, not Catholic light. With compassion.
Silly season, I think you call it silly season.
Yeah, well,
that's your expression.
I'm going to get sued by the Coca-Cola company because I keep saying
you really do.
Catholic light lead to Catholic zero, like Coke light led to Coke zero.
That's really your way of saying it, yeah.
It's untranslatable. I've done that in books.
Bishop Barron says beige Catholicism. Bishop Barron, beige Catholicism. Yeah, that's how he says
it. He's got more liability concerns than I do.
Yeah.
Coca-Cola. But no, I mean, if you look at what happened at St. Patrick's during the plague, during the lockdowns of COVID, this was a center of evangelization because it was a center of compassionate outreach to people
that's right.
really suffering during this horrible period. So it's a combination of clarity of conviction leading to compassion of outreach and then beautiful worship in a beautiful church. So those are the things that I think can be replicated in different forms. I would, if I may put it this way, I would suggest that British Catholics stop feeling defensive. I mean, it was a tough patch for 400 and some years, but that's over. I mean, the problem now is not the legacy of Henry VIII. It's a radical secularism that cannot provide foundations for a vibrant democratic society. It just can't do it.
And we'll have to do it in a British way. There must be a British way to do it. No, that I think you're right. St. Patrick's Soho is just so beautiful, and beauty is such a compelling attraction. It disarms a lot of the hostility towards maybe a kind of proselytizing feel that just puts secular people off. But beauty is, you can't argue against beauty. It captivates you, it enchants you, it brings you into truth and love in a very unoffensive way. Subtle as well. Marian, deeply Marian.
There's something also quite striking about St. Patrick's in that its roof was pierced by a German bomb during the Blitz, which bounced off a pillar and then was buried underneath, and it was an unexploded bomb. So you've got the living memory of what radical godlessness can do, now surrounded by the beauty of the glory of the Lord, as Hans Urs von Balthasar
exactly, yeah.
So
Pope Benedict would approve of that church. I think he would have loved it. Yeah. Finally, just a final, more personal question, if I may. So we have Evelyn Waugh, of course, the passionate English Catholic, who once wrote in a letter to Lady Mary Lygon concerning the grace of God. I believe that everyone in his or her life has the moment when he is open to divine grace. It's there, of course, for the asking all the time. But human lives are so planned that usually there is a particular time when all resistance is down and grace can come flooding in. Was there, if I may, such a moment for you?
I can't say that there was a particular moment for me, but uh, when I have had what is generally called religious experiences, they are almost always involved with music, with great hymn singing, with beautiful polyphony, with Mozart Ave Verum. I mean, these are the things where I feel my mind and spirit lifted in a distinctive way. Um, as you know, there's a third book in my John Paul II trilogy called Lessons in Hope, My Unexpected Life with John Paul II. It's a bit of a memoir. And, there were obviously moments that I could not understand in these terms at the time, but that were preparing me to be what some people call the witness to the witness. And those were, in retrospect, religious experiences. I mean, when I was writing Witness to Hope in 1998, early 1999, I did have the sense that all of my life had been, in some sense, a preparation for this, and that was a great feeling, and it was an experience of grace, I believe.
That's amazing. We cannot forget here in England with Pope Benedict's visit to S. Petrus by Sir James Macmillan as he entered Westminster Cathedral. That was, Carmina Burana, Phantom of the Opera / Ringwraiths from Lord of the Rings. And it divided opinion, but it was certainly cannot be forgotten. So I think for some people that must have done it for them.
James is a friend, and I admire him greatly. I must say that piece just made the statement, we are back. We are back. And
if you look at the comments, it's amazing. The comments are just like, I'm an atheist, but this is so good. And isn't that the case? I mean, it is. John Henry Newman would have probably had a tear in his eye, I imagine, at that. It's very poignant when you're in Westminster Cathedral because they have the list of the established hierarchy since the beginning. Right. Then there's just literally a gap. They leave a gap to where names should be, massive gap, then the re-establishment of the hierarchy. It's so powerful to have that inside the cathedral. So we really loved that moment in our history. So Professor George Weigel, it has been an honour for you to join us today at our studio in Walsingham, and we hope we can speak to you again soon. Thank you.
I look forward to that. Thank you for your time.